Welcome to Armadillocon 2021, and thank you for putting up with my little setup adventure here. My name is Thomas Wagner. I'm the host of the YouTube channel SFF180, and it is my great pleasure to be interviewing this year's special guest, Mr. Marshall Ryan Maresca.
Thank you.
All right.
I'm glad to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise. Good to see you after
you.
2 years.
Yes.
Right? Some human contact. It's like, we did it. All right. I want to start out by talking a bit about the origin story of Marshall. How you started as a writer, what shaped you, what sculpted you, your background.
Wow.
So you don't have to go all the way back to
I was born as a young child.
Yes, when your parents were shot and you became the Batman or anything. We don't have to get into that, but
Right,
we can
yeah.
just get into other stuff.
I think that always I sort of had this idea of that writing, especially writing fantasy, was just what I wanted to do, even if I didn't have a really cohesive idea of what that necessarily meant. And then when I went to college, I got a degree in film and video production and did screenwriting work that way, but also kept dabbling with the idea of writing prose and kept playing around with that, and a lot of experiments that went nowhere along those lines. And but I always kept that in my mind of this is what I want to be doing eventually. And you reach the point when you think that in your head, and you're like, eventually it's got to come sooner or later, or you're just fooling yourself. And I did the NaNoWriMo thing a couple of years, which I think is a great way to learn what kind of writer you are. I don't know if it's necessarily a great way to write a novel, but I started that process, and then eventually was on my way to the first few chapters of something that seemed to be working out. And that was in 2005 that then I read about this writer's workshop that was going on in Austin. That was a one-day thing in some hotel in Austin. I'm like, I should sign up for that and try that out. And so I did that, bringing that first chapter of this book in progress I had, thinking that people were going to tell me this is great, and I'm just doing great stuff, and here's a few notes, but really it's great. No, they tore that to tiny, savage little pieces, but in a way that was really helpful. I mean, it was rough, but it was that good, ice water in the face, wake up call sort of thing. I do need to really up my game if I think I want to take this to something on a professional level. And as would happen, that writer's workshop was attached to this whole convention of other panels and everything, which at the time I actually had no idea that was the case. I really thought it was just this sort of one-day workshop thing on a Friday, and then they were like, here's some stuff, and I'm like, there's whole things happening this week. And thus learned a lot over the course of that, and then came again to the writer's workshop the year after that, and the year after that, and brought then what would become the first chapter of Thorn of Denton Hill, and then brought what would be the year after that, brought what would be the first chapter of Holver Alley Crew. And that year, my instructor for the workshop was Jim Frankel from Tor.
Okay.
And I will always remember, he gave his harsh and curmudgeon-y notes to everyone, and then said to me 7 words that stuck with me and kept my head above the waterline for the years to come, which was, "You have a lot of real talent." And I was you can imagine just being a baby writer in that moment and just be like, okay, that's good. And so,
especially after getting all the abuse from the workshop group.
Yeah, from the workshop group from years before, and it's like, okay, good, I have gained some evolution, and then did the thing of querying and did things of getting an agent, and then got an agent, and then started to teach at the writer's workshop instead of being one of the students. And then I had my agent for a couple of years, and we were out on submission, and then it was reaching the point in 2013 where it was starting to feel like it was coming to a crossroads. It was like, we've been now on submission for a couple of years now. Is this really happening? Do I have to come up with something else? And so my wife and I sort of set this sort of internal deadline. It's like, if nothing happens by the end of the year, we need a new change. We need to come up with a change of plans.
Right.
So we get a call on December 18th that I sold what would become Thorn of Denton Hill and A Murder of Mages, and so that
literally like under the wire.
Literally under the wire.
Yeah, it was like a storybook ending. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about that process then, because first off, now it's interesting. You said that you had no knowledge of Armadillocon at the time. People really get writing careers at the Armadillocon Writers Workshop. There've been quite a few folks. Steve Light,
Nikki Drayden.
Nikki Drayden. You then, would you say that you came from not within fandom circles, or at least not within convention?
No, certainly not within conventions. I was actually unaware that it was a thing that existed until I sort of just stumbled into it because I came across the Writers Workshop really by chance because of, I think it was just like a post on LiveJournal that was cross-posted to some group I was in, and I was just like, oh, that's right here in Austin. Like, because it wasn't even like an Austin-based LiveJournal thing. It was after I got my film degree, I did what, of course, would make sense with a film degree, which is move to Austin and get involved in theater. So I did a lot of directing. I did some playwriting. I did some producing, and I did some acting. And as an actor, as a director, as a producer, I was a good playwright.
Well, you got to find your niche.
Right, and then I wrote a few full-length and short plays, and I had a good time doing that. I did not have a great time in the process of like trying to produce those and put those together. So, and again, then my wife was a good gentle nudger of like, you keep saying you want to write books, so why are you writing why are you messing around with doing theater stuff? And you should just write books. And she was 100% right.
But I'm sure you must have found it instructive.
Oh, absolutely.
Because screenwriting, which I dabbled in a little bit, and of course I did crew work myself, like back in the 2000s in the film community. Screenwriting and playwriting, it's a different approach to narrative. You have to be leaner and more on point. You have to kind of hit your story beats.
Right.
And whereas a novel has all this room to breathe, and you can go on all sorts of narrative, switchbacks and digressions and backstory and all of this. And you don't really have that kind of luxury in film or stage writing, do you?
Right. You have to, especially with stage, you have to find your economy of all things. Like, you can only have either one set or find a way to show multiple places in unique and creative ways. You have to, there's only so many actors that you can fit backstage, so you can, you don't want to have too large of a cast, and things like that certainly sharpen your focus of finding the essentials in your storytelling.
Yeah, that's what I think, that learning that kind of writing.
Right.
Is probably really good for anyone who wants to become a novelist, because at least it helps you, it gives you good grounding in the basics.
And it also gives you a very good ear for dialogue. At least I like to think I have a very good ear for dialogue, because you have to write things that people will say.
Yes.
And that always helps a lot, because, I mean, there's the classic Harrison Ford during the shooting of Star Wars, of like, you can write this shit, George, but you can't say it.
Yeah.
And when you have to write things for people to actually say, and then you also, in working with actors, get an ear for the way the words sound from different voices, and hopefully that sort of experience can give you the ability to write different characters who sound different just with the use of the text.
Yeah, and of course, the whole thing of just when you're writing, just reading your work and reading your dialogue out loud to just see if it sounds
right.
It doesn't sound
like a thing a person would say, as
yes,
opposed to just a lunatic.
It's still to dialogue. You touched on your initial kind of submissions adventure, And I want to get a little bit more into that because you are clearly a man of very ambitious goals. You don't think small, which I think is a great quality. But you know, when you're a noob and you're starting out, that can be kind of a tough sell. I mean, it's. I'm sure. I mean, maybe you did. I mean, did you have this in mind when you were talking to your agents? Like, I have this vast vision of a city and a world, and I've got 4 interconnected trilogies, so we're looking at least 12 books. So I need a publisher who's going to go for this. And you know, you think you sort of came out of the gate with the Thorn of Denton Hill, and then just went into these 4 interlocking trilogies in this setting, which is the kind of thing you would think, all right, if somebody's got like a George R. R. Martin track record, a publisher will be like, all right, we'll go for that. But you know, you came into it as sort of a new and untested writer. And how hard was that, or did you how much of that did you kind of keep close to the vest, your long-term plans?
To an extent, I kept it close to the vest. I remember I sort of put together the bones of what would be like the larger plan, and sent that stuff to my old friend Dan Fawcett, who has been an instrumental sounding board over the course of this whole process. Everything in these books would not be what they are without his input and friendship and guidance. And one of the first things he said is like, okay, for you to pull this off, you either have to be a big dog or get the right publisher. And certainly I feel blessed that along those lines I got the right publisher who, I mean, Jill Gilbert, 9-time Hugo nominee. Jill Gilbert has been exactly the right person in terms of being able to just sort of roll with other mind-boggling, but also with that a degree of temperance, because I'd be like, this is the big plan. She's like, tell me the next step in the big plan, and we will worry about this other stuff later. And my agent sort of had that same, like, he was all for the fact that I have these big plans. It's like, great, that's good. I'm glad we will never run out of stuff, but we will take it one at a time. And so that got shown basically in release order, and in how, in what the way we decided to sell it. Because when I was initially just querying agents, like I had written the full draft of Thorn of Denton Hill and started querying that. And while I was querying that, I'm like, well, I can't just be not writing something.
Twiddling my thumbs.
Twiddling my thumb while I'm querying, so I'm just gonna write. But I'm also like, so I had a friend who had written book 1 and then written book 2 and written book 3, and still book 1 hadn't sold, and then had basically gone so deep into that sort of sunken costs that like just had to keep going linearly with that. I'm like, that's I don't think that's a good choice for me to make. And so I was like, so okay, I'm just gonna. It was also a thing of like, I don't know what's gonna sell, so I'm just gonna keep writing book 1s of these different ideas, and because so then I wrote Whole Rally Crew while I was still querying, and then that was done, and then Mike Kaponko, who became my agent, I had sent him Thorn of Denton Hill as a query, and he wrote back to me, and at that point he's like, hey, I read the whole manuscript, I think it's great, because I read it in like 5 hours, but at this point it was a 70,000 word manuscript. He's like, I cannot sell an adult fiction, fantasy fiction, that's 70,000 words, so beef it up to about 95 to 100 and get back to me. So, and I was like, man, how many of my queries just went right in the bin because I said 70,000 words? And they were just like, nope, and boom. So I did then a whole rewrite of Thorn of Denton Hill to add more muscle and bone to it to get it up to that level of word count, and then sent back to him. He's like, okay, this is great, I'm your agent now. So. But also during that process, I then wrote the first draft of what would become A Murder of Mages, and then while all of those were on submission, wrote the first draft of what would become Way of the Shield. So I would have all these different book 1s that, while they were interconnected in world, none of them were reliant on any one of them being sold to make sense. Okay. So that any one of them could be the one that was the breakthrough, and then.
That's just a very unusual approach.
Yeah, well, it's because I was like, I want one of these to hit, and I don't know which one it will be, so I can't.
But it's a wise approach when you think about it. I mean, because you're right, writers get so invested in the one book.
Right.
And the one, again, as you'll know, again, our background in film, like the aspiring screenwriter. We've all met the guy, right?
Who's been working on that screenplay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like the one that he is just all in, right? And it's his thing, and it's the thing that's going to turn him into Scorsese, right?
Right.
And whereas you're like, well, I can do some of this and do some of this and do some of this and do some of this, and we'll just, it's sort of like, and just see which one works.
Right.
And then, so you have this kind of practical as opposed to purely idealistic, which so many, young newbie creators
The
have.
goal was also ridiculously idealistic of like
Yeah.
somebody will buy all of them and they'll all go for it and then all tie together and be
Yeah.
this amazing thing. But like,
But you had people working with you who were the seasoned professionals who
Yes.
liked the idealism but said, all right, now let's come up with an actual game plan
Yeah.
to make that work, make it practical.
so then I sold Thorn of Den Hill and A Murder of Mages, and like literally the day I put my signature on the contract for Thorn of Den Hill, I'm like, okay, now I can write what would become the Alchemy of Chaos, which was the second book of the Thorn series, which had been like just percolating in my brain for years, but I'm like, I'm not going to start actually writing it until like I actually have a reason to write it. So then I made a point of like, okay, now I can write it. And so while we were in that whole process between you sign the contract and the book actually coming out, which is a big gap. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So I finished Alchemy of Chaos during that time. So then, because I also like, there was that part of my brain that's like worried about that whole sophomore slump sort of thing, of like the people who like get that first book to come out and then they're like, oh, now I have to write book 2 and get frozen up. We know many of those stories. And so I was like, well, one way I can avoid that is if I get it done before anybody's even seen Thorn of Den. So then there will be none of that, like, now I have to meet these expectations, because the expectations won't exist. The one big thing in that is I realized in Thorn of Den Hill, there is a big thing that happens, like a key plot point with the 2 moons of the world, that after I wrote it and like it was out there, I'm like, that is actually physically impossible for 2 moons to do. And so then in the course of writing Alchemy of Chaos, I'm like, I'm going to directly address the fact that that's a physically impossible thing for 2 moons to do, and set up that as like, that's intriguing. Why did it actually happen? And set that thing up. So then, and then in the year between Thorn coming out and Alchemy coming out, I was waiting for that review to call me out. like orbital mechanics doesn't work that way, Marshall.
Yeah.
That review actually eventually did come, but not until several years later, and I was like, you are right, sir. And and I address that in the next book.
Well, you're taking lessons from the best, though, aren't you, on that score? I mean, Hitchcock did that kind of thing all the time. It's like in North by Northwest, when you have, when James Mason is trying all these ridiculously elaborate ways to try to kill Cary Grant, which make no sense logically, right? I mean, if you want to kill a guy, you just
kill him.
Yeah, just do a drive-by. You don't get a crop dusting airplane. But it's cool cinematically, right? And so how do you deal with it? You just have Cary Grant mentioned as, what kind of insane sort of plot are you going to hatch this time? You're going to boil me in oil, and just call attention to the absurd thing, and you can sometimes get away with it. So now I want to talk about, now we've talked about sort of how you made the world happen and how you brought it all to us in the real world. But let's talk now about Maradaine, some of your inspirations for it, where it first sort of germinated in your skull, and the origins of the idea, and specifically with a focus on how you world build. Because in, of course, secondary world, spec fic, world building is the thing, right? It's crucial to it. But you seem to kind of...
I might have some opinions about that.
You
I might have a podcast
you
about
might
that.
have a podcast in which you are competing for the Hugo against a couple of friends of mine, but I won't mention that because you're also a friend of mine. So I have like all of these split loyalties this year. When you take it to, just further stages, you seem to think through the world building from a great many different angles than I think a lot of fantasy writers do. And so, tell us something about kind of how all that germinated and then how you developed it as an idea or set of ideas.
Well, certainly the world itself, it began, like, the first map was drawn in 1993 of the whole world. And there it was definitely as a role-playing game setting was the concept at the time. It was just like the homebrew setting for me and my friends at the time. And so it was very sort of just like broad strokes, very sort of, very traditional fantasy sort of world with then like, this is this part of the world, this is this part of the world, and then
Here's the tavern.
and here's the tavern, yeah, exactly. And then over the course of the first few years, just sort of like adding little details to that. And then there was this fascinating, weird opportunity that came up in about the year 2000. And this came through my friend Dan Fawcett, who, like I said, has been so instrumental in the sort of world building process, that he knew a guy who was starting a game company. And so they were going to put out a series of role-playing supplements, and wanted there to be like the homeworld of this new role-playing system.
Okay.
And he's like, I talked to Dan. Dan says, you've got this world. I think this could be the world for it, but like you obviously need to do more work. The thing that's so funny now that I didn't even understand at the time. This guy's like, and I've got like the plan to do these, to have all these role-playing books. I have 100 ISBNs that I own to do this. And I was like, that's great. I have no idea what that means. And so we did this whole process of then digging deeper into the world building so that it could, with the idea of writing it as more of a like source book for whatever, for campaigns, and thus doing a lot more of like, okay, here's a ton of like deep detailed work on this culture, and then pass it to each other and be like, this is bad, this is, and just like, so it was a note-taking process back and forth between Dan and I. And then this guy who had the 100 ISBNs dropped off the face of the earth, and I never know what happened to him.
Yeah.
So, but then I'm like, well, now I've done this deeper work on this stuff, and then
At least you have to work.
yeah, I have to work. And then as part of that, I started to write one of the two novels that became trunk novels that I wrote before I wrote Thorn of Ten Hill that will stay in the trunk forever. And one of those, which was called The Crown of Jerusalem, which was that first chapter that I brought here in 2005, was very much that travel log. We're going to go from country to country because I've done all this world building work, and now I'm going to show it to you, sort of thing.
Here's the tavern.
Here's the tavern in this country.
Here are the great ruins where
Yes.
this thing happened.
Yeah, exactly. And that book was boring as fuck because it didn't have a plot. It had, let's go from place to place and eat the food and see the people, and and had some good moments. Some moments that like the writing, I'm like, that's really good. And when I was bringing that as like of the large piece as like beta reading to people, they were like, this is a really good sequence. The fact that you have to go through all this garbage to get to this sequence is a problem, but this is a really good sequence. So then I started to think, okay, a big part of the problem here is I'm trying to show everything and why. And so let's narrow the focus, and I'm like, okay, let's narrow the focus to just this capital city and find the stories that can exist within just the city and be, instead of trying to be epic of scale, try to be very personal of scale. And then I was thinking also, right at the time, a lot along terms of the way comic book universes are built, the way some of the things that we're starting to do also in Star Trek books, where it's like, hey, we have this bigger universe to play with all these different characters, and thinking along those lines of like, can I come up with a larger story plot that I want to do that is epic in scale, but keep it micro-focused on groups of characters, and use that as the way to keep it simple from book to book while telling a larger story.
Now, the characters, I've noticed that you do like to focus on groups. You're not all about the hero.
Yes.
And so And of course, you are very much all about cities, you
Yes.
know. And if the term urban fantasy can ever go back to its original meaning, I think you can be that kind of a writer, right? Because it's not so much the traditional, even the notion in epic fantasy that you have of empires and kingdoms, although those exist kind of in the background of your story. But usually what you do is you focus on a location, an urban location, and then there are many different stories, as you said, that can be told. And it's almost like, in cinema, right, there's practically an entire genre called New York stories, right?
Yes.
Where you have this vast metropolis, millions upon millions of people, and there are a million stories in the naked city. So it's like, fantasy doesn't have to, you don't have to build this giant world and then just have your little one band of adventurers, right? Because there's so many lives, so many people, and so much that can go on that can interconnect, but doesn't necessarily have to. So, I want to talk a little bit about, your, groups of characters, teams. Is that partially, I can see the comic book influence there, but also, I guess, the RPG influence, right?
Yes, but also, when you said New York stories and I lit up there for a moment, that was
Yeah.
because that was so much an influence of the way that then I approached the process of writing those and doing the work on the city itself. Because part of what I said to myself was, if I'm going to write stuff in this city, in this fantasy city, I need to understand it the way a New Yorker would understand New York, and try and write it with that same level of verisimilitude. Because if you wrote a story that was set in New York City, but there's just like one bar, one alley where people are where there's panhandlers, and then the governor's mansion, the mayor's mansion, and that's it.
Yeah.
Like, it would feel
Central Park, right?
and Central Park. It would feel really fake.
Yeah.
And so I needed to have that level of detail to the city, and the people populating it. And then, as you said, like, I love to do it with groups because, like, I'm a big believer of the live together, die alone, that nobody can do. Even though in my elevator pitch for Thorn of Denton Hill, where he's fighting a one-man war against the drug cartel, it is so not a one-man war, because constantly throughout that book, he's like, I'm just gonna go do this by myself, and then he almost gets killed, and it's only because he has allies that sort of drag him back. And help
So
him out.
Varanix, is this sort of like chaotic good guy, who just kind of thinks a bit perhaps more highly of his abilities than is warranted.
He jumps in full force with his heart and not with his head. And
Yeah, he doesn't really have necessarily the wisdom of either foresight or hindsight. He just has that kind of commitment to his moral purpose.
Yes, which was always the most fun thing about writing him, is he will always make the right choice to that, but never the smart choice. And so, like, it was like, okay, I am beat down, I am exhausted, I need to just go back home and then hear somebody scream that they need help. It's like, fuck, I'm going in. But yeah, like, I write these in these groups because I'm so big on this sense of, like, finding family and finding your people who will go into it together with you, and then joining in on that. Or even with, say, the case of the Constabulary series, finding your person. I love writing Citrine and Minox so much as just this sort of like, platonic ride or die couple. That it's like, I've been pitching to some people, because I see some people being like, God, why can't there just be something where it's like a man and a woman are the main characters, and there's not a romantic partner? And I'm
it's
like,
not the
let
obligatory
me
romance.
tell you
Yeah.
about Murder of Mages.
Yeah.
Because these people will be there for each other, they will ride or die for each other, they will always have each other's backs, and they will never kiss ever. That is my promise to you. And there should just be more things where just men and women are just friends or colleagues or ride or die.
Yeah, there should be.
partners like that.
Just,
And it's
you
not
don't-
about romance.
Don't
It's
always
about-
have to adhere to that formula.
Yeah.
It's sort of, you'd never make it in the YA field.
Apparently not.
Yeah, evidently not. Okay, now, we've talked a little bit about your heroes, but it seems that, you got bad guys in your story, but it seems to me that your focus in terms of, the villain, the bad guy is really all these, the systemic injustices. There are systems in place that your idealistic heroes want to, kind of, they want everything to be fairer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
So-
is. I mean, people make up the systems that are,
Yeah.
but it is. I think that is so much of a more interesting sort of meta villain of being like just that things are bad because the system is bad or because people are corrupting the system, and that's a more interesting big fight to fight, and rather than, and then it is going to be a fight that's not going to stop. One of my favorite last episodes of a series is the series finale of Angel,
Okay.
where
I didn't make it all the way, I have to confess.
it's
So,
it
go ahead and spoil it. I don't care.
well, okay, because the show did sort of lose its track after a while, but I think the series finale really nailed it, where it's like, okay, we know all of these big bads that are within the city, and we're going to do one big hit to kill all of these guys, and that's all that's going to do is slow the gears of the larger corruption and big bad. But for one moment, we will slow those gears down, and then we'll probably get killed. and it then ends up where they've done their big plan. Some of them have been killed, some of them are badly injured, and they got everyone they meant to get, but then there's like literally an army of demons coming at them. And they're like, oh, okay, here we go. And then the last line, which resonates with me, is, all right, let's go to work. and that's sort of the end of the series. And so I love writing things where the fight is that thing of, we're going to do the best we can for the best outcome we can, but we're going to have to get up tomorrow and go to work. One of the big things in terms of building Maradaine and building the series on a longer scale, and this is a weird comparison I always make, and when I'm talking to sci-fi fantasy people, I get a weird look because it's so outside, is I talk about Mad Men. Because if you watched the whole 7 seasons of Mad Men, it starts in 1960 and ends in 1969. And it tracks this decade of massive social change from a ground's eye view of the characters who are living through it. But you would never guess that that's where it's going to go by watching the first episode of Mad Men. But that's also a thing you never see in fantasy. Fantasy world building, fantasy tends to be very static cultures. And so I wanted to show a culture in the process of change that was in one of those decades where from the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade, there's going to be a lot of changes happening, which is why I have things like that it gets mentioned like, oh, there's elections tomorrow and women can't vote, but there is also a suffragette movement. And so, because somebody here actually came up to me, was like, I was really mad when I read the thing that women don't vote, but then I saw there's a suffragette movement. I'm like, okay, no, he's doing a thing. And so I wanted to write about a place that's changing. And so to do that, you have to sometimes start with bad things in place and then topple those systems. It unconsciously built the philosophy that then became like the catchphrase in the podcast Worldbuilding for Masochists, where we talk about choose versus presume. That so much in fantasy world building is sort of built on these big presumptions that like that's just how fantasy is. That's just like the sort of like faux Renaissance-y medieval Western Europe that it isn't even an accurate portrayal of that, but this sort of idea of what that is. And so I would constantly hit little things and be like, well, I can't have that because that doesn't fit in fantasy. And then I'd be like, why can't I have that? Like, why does fantasy have to be locked into A when I want to do not A? And so that built into creating that sort of choose versus presume mantra that guided our mindset in the podcast, and then became a much more active part of the process when I was writing Velocity of Revolution, where I constantly just like, why am I making that choice? Why did I presume that? Wait, is that the most interesting choice to create a radically different kind of fantasy world?
Yeah, and I want to move forward to that now if we can, because with Velocity of Revolution, I guess, after you've done a dozen Maradaine novels, you're probably like, all right, I'm ready for something else. And you go back and tell another story of a city, but this one is very different. And first off, this is, I guess, what we'll call, for lack of a better term, Dieselpunk, because we're in this sort of petroleum world with machinery. And now we're introducing new elements. And I found that now it becomes something, of course, that impacts the world building profoundly when you suddenly bring in something that isn't what is expected in fantasy. You now have not just the new thing, but everything that is implied by the new thing. If you have a fantasy world with motorcycles, that means you've got an entire industry of metallurgy and the petroleum
and drilling for oil and who has the oil and who's taking the oil.
Yeah, and then that brings the whole, now the economy of that city becomes, that world becomes a major aspect of it. And so you really kind of went very far afield, certainly from Maradaine, with a lot of the elements in when you were creating Zeopar. I've got to say, having read it, this book it's a masterclass in world building, because you bring in all of these weird disparate elements, but they kind of work. I mean, they fit together even though they shouldn't. It's so against conventional wisdom, and you've got, you have everything. The fashion seems to come from a completely different set of influences from, all of the technology. And then you have the city that is sort of rebuilding after a war, and they're under this kind of occupation government at the time to kind of help them get back on their feet. But then there is this rigid caste system that is sort of keeping the citizens in their place.
Right.
And so you have again this rebuilding, this occupation that is really just in service of keeping the status quo and keeping the privilege in the hands of the privileged and everyone else not, right? And you have nightlife, but you can go to the nightclubs and order tacos. There's like food everywhere. Any tacos should just be, in every fantasy novel that exists. If you don't, I don't want to go to your fantasy world if I can't get a frickin' taco.
One of the literal initial influences of how I came up with that book is I was talking with my son, and he's like, every single fantasy book has like these pubs with ale and stew, and it's like, why aren't there fantasy novels with tacos? There should be more fantasy novels with tacos. I'm like, you are 100% correct. There should be. Yeah. And I should make that happen.
But that just shows how little effort goes into so much fantasy world building.
Yeah.
It's like do these worlds have cuisine? Do they have fashion? Do they have couture? Do they have, entertainment? What are the community, just the way people live day-to-day life that we all sort of take for granted, just never really gets addressed. You like digging deep on that.
Yes, I do.
Family relations, the different kind of classes and how people interact. You get universities, it feels like a lived-in environment, not just a setting, not just a backdrop. These are cities where people live, and you can tell, and that it's that immersive.
Yeah, my ultimate goal in the text itself and in the process of world building is I always wanted to feel like there is this richer thing happening beyond. Like, if one could, as if it was like an open world video game, move yourself away from the narrative and go around the corner to somewhere else, that it would feel like going around the corner you would then come across more stores or more shops or more stories or more characters, as opposed to you go around the corner and you see the back of the set and a few extras having a smoke break. It needs to feel like there's so much more going on without then also drowning the text in that sort of like, I'm now going to describe everything, because
there's no exposition dumps. It just, you feel like you're there.
Yes, that is always the goal, to like, or whenever you have some sort of exposition dump, to have it rooted enough in character and moment that it, because I do have that bit which I was like in Velocity, where the one character is like, I am now going to tell you like the creation myth of our people that you never got taught, and so that was a moment I'm like, this is gonna feel a little exposition dumpy. I hope it doesn't come off that way. But then from the feedback I've gotten, I think it came off very well. And then it came off, it is very sort of organic, especially because the other girls were like, why did we never know this about ourselves? And because our own history has been torn away from us and lost.
Mm-hmm. Parts of the culture that you came up with. Now, either in Ziapar, everyone seems to have this kind of pansexual, polyamorous,
Yes.
kind of free love thing going on, which I guess is great. And they talk about how they find it a little baffling about the culture across the sea that has the monogamous.
They get so mad if you like date two people at once. Like, I didn't get it.
And so was that just kind of like a humorous poke at maybe just like real world sort of
Well, that actually
traditional conservatism, mores, what have you, or is it just kind of a way of presenting something differently?
It was a way of presenting something differently. So I wanted to present their cultural norm of being polyamorous and pansexual as being so norm that I then had to, it isn't a thing they discussed, so I had to give an opposition of contrast of like, we were in this place, it's on the other continent, boy, what they do there, like, so that it is a difference to them and use that as a contrast rather than and I made a point of also making that character not be judgmental about it because she is in a relationship with somebody from over there. So she's like,
yeah.
And so because I'm in a relationship with her, I'm going to, honor that way of being, even though it's weird for me. But
because this is sort of where I think philosophy of revolution is far more genre bending than anything you've written before now, because you're bringing in, just the fantasy. I won't say it's low fantasy, but the important thing isn't like the magic system, right? Which is what everybody who's idea fantasy is Brandon Sanderson. You have to have like 300
Very
pages of
specific
appendix.
rules.
Here's the magic system. Here are the rules. This will be on the test. It's just sort of another element of it's just something that it exists there. People use it, whether they're using it like interpersonal relationships, with their partners,
Right.
or whether they're working together, or whether they're out criming, right?
Yeah.
You have this. You have where did the kind of the genesis of that idea?
So a big thing, I just wanted a way for them to interconnect, but I also, because again, so much of the initial concept was I want to have people on motorcycles because motorcycles are cool,
Mm-hmm.
and then when I had this idea of them using this mushroom as a way of interconnection, I'm like, well, I want to make it so then to make the fact that they're racing around on motorcycles important. And so I was like, okay, then what does that give me? That gives me speed. Okay, so let's make speed be such a crucial factor to making the magic stronger. So that then the fact that my main character Wendy has a strange natural disposition to the mushroom that he connects with it stronger than anybody else does, and is also an excellent motorcycle rider, then puts him in this perfect position to be like the super perfect storm of like getting to these next levels that nobody had even conceived of before.
Yeah, in a way you could say it's almost kind of a cyberpunky science fictional concept.
Yeah.
You're bringing in something that's sort of natural to the world, that's serving that function in the story.
Right.
Yeah. It was certainly a challenge for me. I was like, we're talking to my thumbnail artist when he was talking about the velocity thumbnail, and I'm like, okay, so like the bikes, they're not as sleek, and they're not like the ones in Akira, right?
Right.
They're not that sleek, but they could probably go as fast. So come up with what you come up with, and he came up with something. But it's
very excited.
yeah. But it's interesting to see how you just kind of you take certain ingredients that that are disparate, throughout all kinds of spec-fic traditions, and you sort of put it together, and you hit blend, and it sort of becomes an organic whole, which is interesting. Is that just sort of an experimentation thing you do until it just feels right to you?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah.
And like the fashion stuff that you were talking about earlier, like I knew I wanted to have, to just have fun with doing different things with fashion.
Yeah.
But then, not to delve into spoilers, but then I do use that in the end, where the very clothes themselves become part of the plan in the last part. I don't want to spoil it, but I did have a lot of fun with that.
Just read the book. So like, can I get all of our timepieces are there. So can I get just a quick time check?
3:59.
Wow, okay.
Okay.
We're done. Quick. What's next on the horizon for Marshall Reinmeier?
Next on the horizon in 2022, there will be 2 more Maradaine books that will be beginning the proper phase 2 of the Maradaine saga. They are going to be The Assassins of Consequence, which is the next book with Baronix at the center of it, and he is going to up his plans in terms of taking down Venmir's empire, but at the same time, a bunch of his old enemies all escape from prison at once.
Oh, that's not going to be a problem.
That's
at
not
all.
going to be good. And
Okay.
the next one, the one after that coming out in fall 2022 is the Quarrygate Gambit, which is the next one with the Holver crew. The quick description of that one is it is Escape from Alcatraz meets Suicide Squad meets Ocean's 8.
Okay. Nice. And
And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and are we going back to Zeopar?
I do not have a specific plan for that at this time, but if the right story comes to me for that.
Never
but
say never.
Never say never, but at this moment, it stands as a standalone.
Okay, all right. I want to thank you all for attending, watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Marshall, and thanks again. Velocity of Revolution, and the next book coming out in a couple of weeks.
Is
right?
an unintended voyage.
Unintended Voyage, available now from DAW. I'm Thomas with SFF180 on YouTube. Thank you all.